Out on the edge of Wyoming's forgotten hills where winter swallows sound and men don't speak more than they must, a rancher named Elias Trainer made a choice no one understood. He stood at a dusty auction, surrounded by cattle and rusted harness, and handed over $2 not for a mule or a pair of boots, but for a woman whose head was bowed beneath a threadbare shawl, a woman no one else had bid on, a woman with no name. Not yet. The cowboys called it shameful. The town whispered it was foolish. But what no one saw was the ache behind Elias's silence and the prayer he had tucked deep in his chest since the war took his brother, and the fire took his first wife, and the world little by little forgot him. The woman he brought home, Ruth Calder, had been used, dismissed, and discarded more times than she could count. Yet when she walked into Elias's home, she did not cower. She listened to the quiet she cooked for the girls, and slowly she filled in the cracks where love used to live. But what broke Elias was not her kindness. It was her name. The name she gave only after weeks of trust, the name that matched the one he'd been murmuring in his sleep since the war. So what could it mean? Was it coincidence, providence? And what happens when a woman who believes she's unworthy is finally chosen not for service, but for herself? You might think you've heard stories like this before, but this one isn't about a hero rescuing a woman. It's about a man being rescued by the very person the world discarded. And if you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or told your story didn't matter, this tale was made for you. So stay. There's more than dust on this porch. There's redemption, slow and steady like a sunrise that refuses to rush. What happens when her name is revealed? Why had Elias been praying for that name? Will two broken people ever believe they're worthy of love again? Would you like to know? Then come closer. There's healing in this tale, and we've only just begun. Ready for part one, she was covered in dust when he brought her home. But her presence changed the whole house. The wind came down off the mountain like it had something to prove, carrying the sharp sting of coal dust, horse sweat, and burnt grain. Stillwater wasn't a place folks stayed long, just a brittle town of tired timbers and broken windows, holding its breath between yesterday's fire and tomorrow's silence. She stood on the old freight crate like it was the last thing tethering her to the earth. A burlap sack was draped over her head, loose rope gently binding her wrists. She didn't flinch, didn't fold. She stood like a weathered cottonwood, all knotted grace and dry defiance. Last one of the week, the auctioneer muttered half to the crowd, half to the wind. No name, no kin. Been passed through 3 towns. Says nothing. But she ain't mad, ain't sick, just quiet. Starting at $2. No one stepped forward. A few murmured. One man spit tobacco and laughed like the idea itself was an offense. And then came the creak of boots on packed earth. A man stepped from the far end of the square, long-framed shoulders, worn from hard winters, eyes the color of riverbed stone. He didn't speak much in town. Folks called him Elias Trainer, the widowed woodworker who carved all his tools by hand and never once haggled a price. $2, he said, voice low but sure. The auctioneer squinted. You sure, Trainer? No returns. Elias nodded. Didn't come here for a refund. Came for a person. Even the dust paused at that. They scribbled his name on a receipt, Elias Trainer, 6 miles east by Dry Creek Bend. Then the man turned to the figure on the crate. State your name for the record, the auctioneer said. There was a hush. The burlap moved. A voice came low, raspy, clear as frost on a windowpane. Ruth Calder. Elias froze. It was a name he hadn't heard in over 15 years. A name he'd whispered to the trees once after a blizzard had nearly taken him, and a stranger with gentle hands had dragged him to a fire spoon, fed him broth, and vanished before he woke, leaving only a stitched handkerchief marked with the letter R. That night, as the wind moaned low through the cracks in his cabin walls, Ruth sat silently in the corner, still not removing the burlap sack. Elias didn't push. He laid a warm wool blanket over her shoulders, set a tin cup of herb tea beside her, and returned to his bench carving wood, not because he needed to, but because silence needed something to do. Hours later, her voice came from the shadows. Why'd you buy me? Elias didn't look up. His hand stilled. Because I don't believe people are for sale. And something, maybe something deep and old, softened inside her shoulders. He hadn't asked if she was the woman from long ago. He didn't need to. Sometimes the soul knows before the mind catches up. The name Ruth Calder fell like a half-remembered melody into the dry air, not loud but enough to stir something. Elias had buried the truth that a person may disappear from your life, but not from your heart. The cabin stood like a held breath between the hills. Rough-hewn, pine-patched roof, a single stovepipe rising like a lonely sentinel against the dusk. It was not much, but it was Elias Trainor's world. Built with hands that buried a wife too young, raised no children, and kept too many winters company. Ruth Calder sat in the rocker by the hearth, the burlap sack finally gone, but her hair still tied back in a tight, low bun, like a soldier's knot. Her hands rested in her lap, still bound by memory more than rope. She hadn't spoken since the night before, not even when Elias served her his last can of peaches, or when she startled awake from a dream and he quietly handed her a blanket already warm. Not everyone who's quiet is broken, he said, more to the fire than to her. Sometimes silence is the only place no one can twist your words. Ruth blinked slowly. You talk gentle for a man who lives alone. I live alone, Elias said, because I got tired of people asking me what I lost. The fire cracked. She looked at him, then really looked. The beard grizzled, eyes carved by years. A man who didn't buy her to own her, but maybe to remember something. Or someone. I knew a man once, she said softly, who got caught in a snowstorm. His leg was near froze through. I dragged him to my shack, fed him potato soup, kept the fire going 3 days. But when I came back from hunting rabbit, he was gone, left only the soup pot clean and a splinter of wood carved into a little bird. Elias's hand trembled slightly as he set down the spoon he was whittling. I kept that bird, she said. Never knew his name. I knew yours, he said. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full, the kind of quiet that only comes when two stories realize they'd been chapters in the same book all along. She stood slowly. Her joints ached from years of hard floors and harder men, but she stood anyway and moved closer to the fire. To him. I got no place to go, Ruth said. But I won't be a burden. You're not, Elias replied. You're a presence. There's a difference. The log snapped in the hearth and let out a golden ember that danced for a moment, then faded. Later that night, she fell asleep in the rocker, and he on the floor nearby, not as a guard, but as a companion. When a woman gives you silence and not suspicion, when she trusts your space more than your promises, that's the beginning of something worth tending. It began with a letter, not addressed to Ruth Calder, but left at the general store, handed over with a squint and a mutter by the postmaster. It bore no return address, only a smudged seal, and her name written in a hand that once bruised and once begged. She didn't open it right away. She slid it into the drawer where Elias Trainor kept seed packets and a folded map of Oregon he swore he'd never use. The letter lay there like a sleeping snake. That week the air warmed. Snowmelt trickled from the hills. Elias tilled the small patch of earth out back, and Ruth kneaded bread without speaking of the past. But it clung to her, not like a ghost, but like a fever returning slow. He noticed it. The quiet stiffened. Her eyes clouded. And though her hands still folded dough, they did it with the distance of someone making bread for a house that was no longer home. One morning he spoke. You afraid it's him? Ruth didn't flinch. I'm afraid he remembers me too clearly. Your past doesn't make you unworthy, Elias said gently. It makes you true. I don't know how to be in a life where I'm not running. Then maybe it's time you rested. She looked at him, and there it was again, that ache of almost love, the yearning not to be rescued, but to be received. But love at their age wasn't a firestorm. It was a flickering lamp on a windy night, needing hands, not hearts, to protect it. Later in the garden, she knelt beside him, her dress muddied sleeves, rolled up hair beginning to gray at the roots. Do you believe people can change? She asked. Elias wiped his brow. I believe people return sometimes to each other, sometimes to themselves. That night she opened the letter, and the next morning she didn't mention what it said, only that she'd burned it in the stove. I chose not to carry it anymore, she whispered. Elias didn't ask what it was. He just poured her the last of the morning coffee and sat beside her on the steps, watching a new seedling press up through the earth. Some things don't need to be spoken to be understood, and some silences speak louder than history. The chickens had taken to following Ruth Calder. She never called them by name, just whistled low and soft, and they came pecking and trusting like children that remembered gentleness. So did the neighbor boy Tommy, whose mother had died last winter. He would sneak over in the afternoons and pretend he was there for Elias's tools, but it was Ruth who taught him how to mend a shirt and boil potatoes. Elias Trainer, watching from the porch, saw at first the way she stood straighter now, the way she didn't flinch at every knock on the door, the way she began to laugh, not often, but like something long frozen cracking in the sun. She began sewing again, not for money, for the feeling of cloth in her hands. She sang while she baked, sometimes old hymns, sometimes nonsense. But her voice was clear, and it no longer trembled at the edges. "Elias," she said one night as they shelled peas in silence, "thank you for letting me be useful without needing me to be perfect." He didn't say anything at first. Then I never wanted perfect. Just someone real enough to stay. That night she didn't sleep in the extra room. She didn't sleep in his either. She pulled a blanket to the porch swing and watched the stars. By morning he brought her a cup of coffee and said nothing. The past had loosened its grip, not erased, not forgotten, but loosened. And that was enough for now. Some wounds don't close with time, they close when someone holds them and says, "I'm not afraid of this part of you." Ruth Calder was laying linen on the clothesline when she heard it, that name, said low by a passing horseman. A man headed east, telling the ranch, hand by the fence, about a woman who once belonged to Silas Moat, the bootlegger from Copper Gulch. She ran off, the man chuckled, heard tell he carved her name into the barn wall, still waiting. Elias Trainer, overhearing from the porch, dropped the wood he'd been splitting. Ruth heard the thud. She froze, hands still damp from the wash. Silas Moat. Her first husband, not by love, but by debt. The man who'd owned her like furniture. Who never called her Ruth, only woman. She'd run when the law came for him, dragging chains and fire. She never looked back, and never spoke of it. Later that evening, when she found Elias by the barn, she stood silent a long while before saying, "It's true. I was his wife. I was 20. My father owed him money. He used me to settle the debt." Elias didn't meet her eyes at first. "Is he coming for you?" he asked. She shook her head. He'd rather own a ghost than face the living. He nodded, but his hands were tight on the railing. "You should have told me." Her voice cracked soft and aching. "I wanted to, but you were kind, and I didn't want to be pitied. I wanted to be chosen, not rescued." That night they didn't share coffee, didn't share silence. The porch swing swayed empty in the breeze. In the barn, even the mules seemed to sense the hush. When love meets truth, it sometimes shivers before it softens. The frost came early that year. Thin silver lined the windows of the bunkhouse, and by dawn the air stung lungs, like a truth too long held back. Ruth Calder had stayed in her room 3 days. Not hiding, just quiet. She didn't run. That was the difference. In her younger years, she'd have disappeared into the hills with nothing but a shawl and a sack of jerky. But not now. Now she waited. On the morning of the 4th day, Elias Trainer knocked once, then entered. He didn't say much at first, just stood with his hat in his hand looking out the window at the horses moving slow in the pasture. "I've been thinking," he said, voice like dry leather, "about how you said you wanted to be chosen, not rescued." Ruth didn't turn. She only nodded once. "Well, I reckon I wasn't rescuing you when I bid them $2. I think maybe I was rescuing myself." That made her turn. "You brought light into this place," he went on. "You think it's shame what you carry, but I see it now, it's strength. You lived through him. You lived, and you still got gentleness in your hands. That's no small miracle, Ruth." He walked to the table and placed something down. It was her old locket, the one she hadn't worn in years, thinking it tainted by old hands. "I cleaned it," he said. "You deserve to wear it your own way now. Not his memory. Yours." Ruth stared at it a long time, and then with trembling fingers she opened it. Inside she found a small note tucked behind the photograph of her younger self. His handwriting. "You were never furniture. You were always home." She covered her mouth with her hand. Tears came quiet and clean. Outside, the first snow began to fall. No thunder, no warning, just the soft, steady hush of something old being made new. And from the porch a child's voice called out, "Miss Ruth, Papa says, come help with supper, Papa." Her knees almost buckled at the sound of it. Sometimes freedom doesn't look like escape. It looks like being seen fully and still being chosen. The winter deepened, but inside the ranch house, warmth bloomed. Not from the stove, though it crackled merrily. Not just from the lamb stew simmering or the quilt that Ruth Calder stitched in the evenings. No, it was something else, something quiet, slow-growing. Like the way a garden takes root under snow before the world ever sees green again. Elias Traynor had changed, not in loud ways. He still grumbled at the woodpile and muttered to the hens. But now he said please to her, and thank you, and stay. And Ruth, for the first time in many decades, no longer apologized when she took up space. She spoke freely at supper. She braided the girls' hair. She added a pinch of cinnamon to the biscuits without asking first, and she laughed. It was quiet but real. It startled them all the first time. One night after the girls had gone to bed, Elias stood in the doorway, watching her fold linens. You know, he said, I thought I was just buying a hand to help. But what I got, he paused, swallowed, was a woman who taught my daughters what a good woman looks like. Ruth looked up. Her voice was steady. And what does that look like? Elias? He stepped closer, brushed her hair from her face the way one brushes dust from an old sacred book. Like you, he said. It looks like you. They didn't kiss, not then. It was better than a kiss. It was a moment of choosing. And the next morning when the sun warmed the porch, Ruth Calder sat beside the girls not as a helper. Not as a guest, but as someone finally home. Sometimes the love we thought we missed was only waiting to find us when we could stand tall enough to receive it. Would you like to hear what came after this moment or another story like this one? Let us know in the comments. And if this touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga. Share this with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Leave a comment. What part moved you most? Would you like to hear more stories of love that comes late but lasts? Sometimes love doesn't come galloping in with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives on tired feet through the back door wearing borrowed clothes and carrying old wounds. In the quiet corners of Elias's ranch and the slow afternoons beside Ruth, we were reminded of something many of us forget with age, that it's never too late to be chosen, to be seen, to be loved, just as we are. $2 didn't buy Ruth. It bought time. It bought shelter. And eventually it bought a second chance for both of them. If you've ever felt discarded, overlooked, or simply wondered if the best parts of your life are already behind you, maybe you can carry this story with you, as proof that even in the dustiest seasons of our lives, there's still a bloom waiting to rise. Because healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispers, you're home now. If this story moves something quiet in you, we'd love to hear about it. Would you like to see more stories like Ruth and Elias's, or perhaps a continuation of their life together? Let us know in the comments below. Share this story with someone who needs hope. And don't forget to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga for more tales of gentle redemption, quiet dignity, and unexpected love. We're so glad you were here with us, and we can't wait to tell you another story next time.